Well, thank you all for joining us today. I might just give it one more minute before we officially get started, but I want to welcome you all to the our webinar today on Climate and Health 101. So I'll go ahead and get started, and I think most people know who I am, so if they missed that part, it's probably fine. But my name is Barbara Richter, and I'm the Executive Director at the New Hampshire Association of Conservation Commissions. And for those of you who don't know, NHACC is a nonprofit organization, and we're working to support our New Hampshire Conservation Commissions so that they can better protect their local natural resources. And we've partnered with the New Hampshire Healthcare Workers for Climate Action, which is a grassroots organization, a non-partisan coalition of healthcare workers, to present this webinar series. And we felt that this was important to help increase awareness of the changing climate and also the physical and mental health issues that come along with that. So today's program will focus on the basics of climate science and how climate change impacts our health. We'll also learn a little bit about adaptations to protect ourselves from these impacts and suggested actions you can take to stay healthy. So our presenter today is Dr. Bob Dewey. He's a retired cardiologist who practiced for 30 years at the Catholic Medical Center in Manchester, New Hampshire. And while caring for cardiac patients, he witnessed how extreme heat and poor air quality would complicate these patients' care. Bob has been a community volunteer and past president and longstanding board member of the New Hampshire affiliate of the American Heart Association. And as an outdoor enthusiast, he has a special interest in maintaining green space and protecting our local forests. Bob and his family have spent a great deal of time hiking in the White Mountains, and he's eager to help preserve this legacy for his grandchildren. So thank you, Bob, for joining us today. And before we get started, just a few quick items to go over. I want to recommend that everybody stay muted for this program so that we have better audio quality. We do invite you to ask questions in today's programs. As the program's going on, you can use the chat box at the bottom of your screen there to ask any questions, and we'll get to the questions at the end of the program. And we should have time for you to also raise your hand and actually ask a question in person as well. But if you don't want to forget your question, you can put it right in the chat box as we move along. So with that, I would like to welcome Dr. Bob Dewey to the program to introduce us to the Climate Change and Health 101.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. I'll go ahead and share my screen here. Get the slides up. Thank you for that nice introduction. I'm delighted to be here. And our group, New Hampshire Healthcare Workers for Climate Action, is really pleased to have be able to offer this series of 3 noon lectures to your group. We have another one coming up, 2 more actually in May, on environmental justice and health, and then a 3rd one on open spaces and the climate effect on mental health. So some good things coming up in the near future. But I'm delighted to go ahead and get started. Before we do get started, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about our group. We came together probably about 3 years ago now as a group of healthcare workers who were concerned about the health impacts we were seeing from the climate crisis and the fact that these were really kind of overlooked, and saw that there was a definite knowledge group, and we came together to try to start talking about that. And we are a group made up of all volunteers, healthcare workers of all types, from doctors, nurses, nurse practitioners, physical therapists, mental health workers, school guidance counselors, and our ages range from medical and nursing students all the way up to older retired people like myself. And our mission is basically to teach other healthcare workers, because there is a real knowledge gap here, and the public certainly, about these health impacts of the climate crisis, hoping that as people learn more about this, it will spur demand of climate solutions, from our political and business leaders. So we really are trying to move the climate crisis up on everybody's priority list, knowing that when they learn about these impacts that affect their families and their communities, they'll start demanding more action. So with that, we'll just go ahead and get started. There we go. They always say you should say why you're here, and like a lot of you volunteers in the conservation commissions, I'm just basically trying to leave a better world for my 4 grandchildren here, feeling that we've got to do something for them to have a good life. So here's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to review just the science of climate change briefly. Then we'll talk about the impact of climate on human health, drilling down to New Hampshire when we can, and then we'll close with solutions and suggested actions. So with respect to the science of climate change, and I'm sure this is a pretty savvy group, and understand there's a real difference between climate change and weather. And climate change is just measuring the average change in conditions over time, primarily temperature and rainfall. And although there can be tremendous day-to-day variation, as we know, and but the change is shown here, and that is that the temperature has definitely just been going steadily up since we started burning fossil fuels in the mid-1800s. And this, of course, is due to the greenhouse effect. And historically, the Earth is heated by this radiant energy from the sun, and about 30 to 35% of that radiant heat gets reflected back into space, and it keeps the atmosphere in this nice little sweet spot for life. And as we've been collecting these greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which are primarily CO2 and methane, the molecular structure of these compounds is such that they will actually hang on to heat. They hold heat. So less heat is being reflected back into space, and the atmosphere is definitely warming. The scary thing about CO2 is that CO2 stays in the atmosphere for up to 1,000 years. Methane has a much shorter half-life in the atmosphere. It degrades in about a decade, but as you know, methane has about 80 times the heat holding capacity of CO2. So in effect, actually, about 1/3 of the warming we're experiencing now is due to methane. But here is a look at CO2 levels over time. And this is the Keeling curve. And you can see that going back 800,000 years, that we've kind of varied between 260 and 180 parts per million. And these are measurements that were obtained from ice cores, where you can measure the CO2 in bubbles in the ice. And you can carbon date the ice and then measure the CO2. And you can see that when we started burning fossil fuels here, the CO2 levels started to go up. By 1950, it was over 300 parts per million, and we're now up to over 420 parts per million. And unfortunately, it is still going up. And you can see in this slide the relationship between temperature and CO2, and they certainly do mirror each other very precisely. And this greenhouse effect is really nothing new. We've known about this for a long time. It was first described in the 1850s. And this is an article from Popular Mechanics from 1912 that basically said that we're adding about 7 billion tons of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere yearly. This tends to make the air a more effective blanket for the Earth and to raise its temperature. The effect may be considerable in a few centuries. Well, unfortunately, we're learning now it hasn't taken a few centuries, and we've got a real problem here. Let's see. Someone needs to be admitted here. Okay. There we go. And this is a report from the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They issue reports a couple times a year, and this is from March of 23, where it was determined that all this warming was unequivocally due to human activity, that no other model could account for the amount of warming, that we had raised temperature of 1.1 degrees Celsius since the mid-1800s. I think we're now up to 1.2 or 1.3, and that will reach 1.5 within a decade or two. And the reason we focus on 1.5 degrees Celsius is that was the the amount of rise that the Paris Climate Accords were trying to keep us below. Remember, the Paris Climate Accords took place in 2015, and it's known that once you get much above 1.5 degrees, there's going to be a lot more sea level rise and other downstream effects from warming. And so the goal was to try to keep us below 1.5. And sadly, we are going to blow right by that. And in fact, New England and New Hampshire, we're already at 1.5. We're kind of a little bit on the leading curve of this, probably due to our adjacency to the Arctic. And in fact, the Gulf of Maine is in the 95th percentile for warming bodies of water. So this is already affecting us in New Hampshire and New England. Now, this is kind of a busy slide, and this is one of those slides with, I think, some good news and bad news. This is CO2 emissions on the y-axis and time on the x-axis, and you can see that, you know, if we hadn't done anything to mitigate CO2 emissions like we have been for the last couple of decades, we'd be up in this range of no climate policies, where we'd be looking at, you know, probably a 5-degree Celsius increase. In fact, our current policies are pointed us towards a 2.5 to 2.9 degrees Celsius increase. And our goal is to try to keep it below 1.5, which obviously is not going to happen. But to do that, we have to be carbon neutral by about 2050. You can see down here. And so these pledge targets are what people have said they're going to do at all these international meetings. But in fact, the current policies are heading us about 2.5. So how does this affect our health? First of all, let's just talk a little bit about the magnitude of it. This is an editorial from a couple of years ago in the New England Journal entitled "Call for Emergency Action to Limit Global Temperature Increase, Restore Biodiversity, and Protect Health." And in this editorial, which was published in over 200 medical journals the same month worldwide, and nothing like that has ever happened in organized medicine. This editorial is basically a call to action to the medical community to say this is absolutely the real deal, that you as healthcare workers have to learn about this so you can advise your patients, you can treat your patients, and finally, try to be a leader in your community for advocating for doing something about the climate crisis. And that's really what our volunteer group is trying to do. The same month that this editorial came out, the World Health Organization declared that climate change was the #1 health problem worldwide, the #1 health emergency, causing more morbidity and mortality than really cancer and heart disease combined. And this is a study from NRDC from 2021. They did a study on the cost of health impacts from climate change and fossil fuel pollution in the United States only. And the cost in 2020 topped $80 billion a year. And to put that number in perspective, the cost of cardiovascular disease, with my former specialty, which we know is still the world's #1 killer, the cost of cardiovascular disease is $300 billion a year. So it really pales in comparison to the health impact of the climate crisis. So this kind of shows what's going on. We have increasing CO2 levels leading to rising temperatures, more extreme weather, and rising sea levels. And all of this spins out into causing problems with air pollution, changes in vector ecology, increasing allergens, water and food impacts, environmental degradation, extreme heat, and severe weather. We'll talk about 4 of these in today's talk. So let's start with extreme temperatures. We know it's getting hotter. It's pretty clear, and this just quantifies it a little bit. This is some data showing the number of the heat wave frequency per year, which is definitely going up. Here's some data from Climate Central showing the number of extreme heat days in Concord, New Hampshire, and in the last 50 years, that's gone up 7 days and is expected to go up quite a bit more in the next couple of decades. And finally, the January warming is very dramatic. And in fact, we do know that even though the extreme heat in the summer is what gets all the press, the biggest amount of warming is actually occurring in the winter. And we saw that certainly this year with kind of an on again, off again winter here in New Hampshire. And the Lancet is a medical journal in Britain, and they have really taken climate and health to heart and have started publishing the Lancet Countdown, which is a journal really dedicated to health and climate change. And in December's issue, there's just a few points that I just wanted to point out that US heat deaths have increased 88% in the last 22 years in the elderly. Global heat waves resulted in loss of productivity of $80 billion in 2021. And that globally, 127 million people experienced food insecurity due to heat waves and droughts. So just a huge problem worldwide. And so far as the mortality of heat goes, it's definitely on the rise. Historically, the CDC reported about 700 heat-related deaths annually, as recent as 2020. But we know this is going up. And remember the heat dome in the Pacific Northwest in 2021 when, geez, I'm having trouble here. When Portland, Oregon was up to 120 degrees for a couple of days, and there were about 1,000 deaths related to that. 60,000 in a big heat wave they had in Europe in 2022, and worldwide about 500,000 annually. And if you look at it per capita by ethnicity, this is data from the United States, you see that in fact, deaths per 1 million people from heat is highest in Native Americans and African Americans. And this is just the first example of many that we will see about the social injustice of the climate crisis. The fact that the people who had the least to do with causing this problem absolutely suffered disproportionately. And this will be a recurring theme. So what does extreme heat mean for us personally? Well, there's several grades of heat, starting with just mild symptoms, heat exhaustion, and then heat stroke. And the first thing when we get hot, the first thing happens, the body wants to release heat. So what the body does to try to do that is the arteries and veins will dilate in our arms and legs to try to get blood near the surface of the skin so you can radiate off some heat. And so when you dilate your vessels, your blood pressure falls, and so your heart rate has to go up to compensate for that. So our heart rates go up and our blood pressure goes down. And if you happen to be one of my former patients who was on a diuretic or blood pressure medication, you can see that this could result in a rapidly downward spiral. And it can lead to heat stroke, where your temperature is greater than 104. And this is just a huge medical emergency, where these people come into the emergency room. You can't just put them in a room with a fan. You have to really pop them into an ice bath to get their temperature down very quickly, because this has a very high risk of mortality and acute kidney injury and failure if it doesn't get turned around quickly. And so far as sweating, it's just important to know the limitations of sweating. Sweating is really our first line of defense against heat. But it's not getting the sweat on the skin that cools us, it's the evaporation of the sweat off the skin that actually causes the cooling. And so on these very hot and humid days, when the air is already very saturated with humidity, our sweat cannot evaporate as effectively. And so we really lose our first line of defense. Sweating really becomes ineffective on these very humid days, which is just important to remember. Now, who's at risk for heat injury? Inner city populations, again, people who live downtown in maybe a 3-story walk-up that's not air conditioned are going to suffer greatly. And it's because we know we have these so-called heat islands where downtown, where there's a lot of asphalt and not much green space, the temperature can be 10 to 15 degrees higher than the adjacent countryside. And in Manchester, we now have opened cooling centers, and public health officials try to get the word out when there's a heat on the way so that people can get into these cooling centers. But again, inner city populations, again, speaking to the social injustice of the climate crisis. Athletes are another group that can get in trouble with this, and the number of heat injuries and actually heat deaths are increasing. As kids go out to the football field in August for their workouts. And then, of course, anybody who works outside is going to be at some risk. A group that is actually very high risk are all these people who drive delivery trucks. UPS, it's been shown that in the truck can get up to 150 degrees inside. In fact, their union has now insisted that their trucks become air conditioned, which they have not been. And then, of course, children and the elderly don't have the compensatory mechanisms to really help deal with the heat. Okay, so now we'll just switch gears and go to air quality. And whenever you burn fossil fuels of any type, whether it's solid, coal, liquid gasoline or oil, or even a gaseous methane, so-called natural gas, you get these fossil fuel related pollutions: ground level ozone, nitrogen dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and particulate matter. And I just want to talk a little bit about particulate matter, very, very small pieces of organic material as a side effect of combustion. And they come in 3 different sizes. PM10 is less than 10 microns. It comes from road dust, wildfires, and demolition. And PM2.5, which is the one you often usually see reported in air quality indexes. PM2.5 comes from burning fossil fuels and also from wildfires. And then ultrafine particulate matter, less than 1/10 of a micron, comes from tailpipe exhaust. And you can see their relative size compared to human hair. And keep in mind that these particles are actually, most of them are smaller than a red blood cell. So very small particles. So how does this impact our health? Well, particulate matter has been shown to absolutely worsen COPD in adults and be a known cause for asthma in children. Particulate matter is also a carcinogen. And it also can cause vascular events such as stroke and heart attack. Well, how does it do that? Well, if you think about it, these particles are just so small that you can inhale them deeply into your lungs, and they can get into the alveolar sacs, shown here in this diagram, and the alveolar sacs is where air exchange takes place, and they're so small that they can actually cross the capillary membrane and get into your vascular supply. And that once there, they can really go anywhere. And in fact, studies have shown that in people who live in areas of high particulate matter, at autopsy, these folks very often have particulate matter seen in their brain. So it does travel around, and when you get these foreign bodies in your vascular supply, it increases inflammation, and so that can lead to vascular events such as stroke and heart attack. Obviously, this can also increase the risk of dementia. There's a lot of pregnancy complications for people who live in areas of high particulate matter, such as premature birth and low birth weight. And then cognitive behavioral and problems in children who live in these high particulate areas. Now let's just look at New Hampshire. This is data from New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services. This was reported in 2017, and this is basically the estimated annual health incidence, from air pollution. And so, we think New Hampshire is kind of a rural state, but we have this problem right here. And when you look at this, particulate matter causes almost 1,300 premature deaths annually in New Hampshire, 67,000 lost workdays, 500,000 acute respiratory illnesses, and a valuation of $3.7 billion. And when you think about this, this is really sort of like a surcharge that our state is paying the fossil fuel industry, because we're burning these fossil fuels, and then we have to pick up the pieces for the health problems that they cause. But $3.7 billion annually just in New Hampshire is a pretty striking number. Now, all that's bad news. There is some good news in all of this, and that is reducing these pollutants really will improve health, and it will do so very quickly. That's the good news. And this is just an example of that. This is a study from the summer of 1996, when the Summer Olympics were in Atlanta, Georgia. And this led to a 23% reduction in morning traffic, which is really a pretty modest decrease. But it led to a 28% reduction in ozone and also particulate matter levels. And during that 2 weeks, there was a 42% reduction in ER visits for children with asthma. So this is a great example of a very modest improvement in air quality results in a really big improvement in health. And we saw the same thing early during COVID, when people weren't going to work. Air quality improved everywhere, and ERs documented much fewer admissions with respiratory illnesses. And the best example of this is the Clean Air Act from 1970, and conceivably, I think, Richard Nixon's finest moment. And in fact, when you look back at this, the EPA was started during a Republican administration. The Clean Air Act passed in a bipartisan way, and it led to a reduction in pollutants of 73%. And the health benefits that accrued following this, I think, are actually staggering. And so this is over 50 years, 230,000 fewer deaths per year over 50 years, 2.4 million fewer asthma attacks per year. And one that's near and dear to my heart is 200,000 fewer heart attacks per year over 50 years. So this is just a great example of, the people that didn't want this passed were saying, oh, it's going to cost us too much. We can't do it. The economy's, too fragile right now. But in fact, like all examples, when you improve the environment, it paid us back hugely. And the cost of implementation of the Clean Air Act was paid back 30-fold just in savings from healthcare. Just tremendous. So, so that's great news, but the not so great news is that we still have room for improvement. And this is a report from the American Lung Association from 2022, showing that still, despite the improvements, 40% of Americans still live in areas of unhealthy air, and populations of color are 3 more times likely to live in these areas. They also just did some extrapolation showing that because we know the health benefits of improving the air, that, as we transition to zero emission energy and transportation, by 2030, the cost savings just in healthcare is going to be 1.2 trillion. So although the transition is going to take some effort and cost, there is still tremendous savings to be gotten out of this. And yeah, we'll just go on from there. And before I leave air, I just want to say a few things about pollen. As a cardiologist, I saw a lot of patients who had COPD just because smokers also get heart disease. And we saw as long ago as 20, 25 years ago that our patients with COPD would come in for their cardiology visit and be wheezing, or their COPD would be very decompensated. And I would call either their pulmonologist or their allergist and say, hey, so-and-so is not looking so good. Maybe he could use some steroids. And the allergist would always say, oh my gosh, this has been the worst pollen season we've ever had. And, we would hear this, time and time, and kind of roll our eyes. But in fact, we weren't connecting the dots back then. And in fact, that's really what was going on. And you see in this slide that because of the warming climate, the growing season has lengthened by 34 days in the last 50 years. So a longer growing season means more pollen. And we also talked about the high CO2 in the atmosphere. And CO2, as we know, drives photosynthesis. And so that makes plants bigger, and they pump out a higher concentration of pollen. So we are seeing a longer growing season and a more intense season. And in fact, pollen levels are up 42% just from 2001 to 2010. So in fact, the allergists were exactly right. These patients were decompensating because of pollen, and the pollen was coming from the warming planet and from the high CO2. So this is just a perfect example of this problem impacting our health. Okay, now we're going to transition to extreme weather events. And what can we expect in New Hampshire? Well, even though we just have an 18-mile seacoast, we can expect more storms, storm surge, and of course, increasing heavy rainfalls. And in fact, this shows that in New England, we are experiencing more heavy downpours, not always necessarily more rain, but it just comes all at once. And that's just because for every degree the air increases in temperature, it increases 4% in its ability to hold moisture. So the air is just, higher humidity levels. And so when it starts to rain, it will just rain hard. And this last summer certainly was the wettest on record that we've ever had since records started in 1895. And in June, July, and August, greater than 21 inches of rain. Yeah, we remember it well. It was kind of nonstop. This just shows the higher tides and more coastal flooding that we can expect along the coast. And so far as New Hampshire, we are predicting 10 to 14 inches of sea level rise in the next 30 years. I actually think that's an old estimate, and I think probably most climate scientists would say it's going to be more than that. There's a lot of properties at risk along the coast, we can expect, according to this data, about 4 big coastal flooding events per year as the sea level rise continues. So how does this affect our health? Well, obviously, if there is a big flood and rain and trees fall down and whatnot, there's going to be an increased incidence of accidents and traumatic injury. And then also on a local level in towns, if your water treatment plant gets flooded and then cross-contaminates into the water supply, there can be viral and bacterial contamination. And also remember, New England was built historically along waterways, along rivers and canals. And so there is a lot of contaminants in the soil along these riverways. And when we get flooding, that can get released. And of course, whenever there's flooding like this, it will increase mental health problems. And this is just some recent data showing that this past year, 2023, as we know, was the highest rain record. And the raw sewage runoff in the Merrimack River was greater than 2 billion gallons. And I think the previous record was well under 1 billion. And this was just due to the record rainfall overwhelming the sewer systems. And whenever there is a raw sewage runoff event, they, obviously will create high bacterial counts downstream that will last for several days. And in fact, just to fix Manchester, the infrastructure investment is going to be about $300 million. So just another way that the changing climate is affecting us. And if you look at billion-dollar disasters, as recent as 30 years ago, there were very few per year. And now the number of billion-dollar disasters has gone up. In 2020, there were 22 of them. So, and they're going to just keep going up as we, primarily related to hurricanes in the South, and also related to the fact that we can't quite seem to learn that we shouldn't build so close to the coast, but definitely an effect from climate change. Okay, now we're going to switch to vector-borne diseases. And so a vector-borne disease is just an infection transmitted by mosquitoes, ticks, or fleas. And examples that we know very well here in New England are West Nile, Triple E, Lyme disease, and malaria. And this is a friend of mine that we walk our dogs occasionally, and this dog name was Lucky, and Lucky wasn't too lucky this day. We went on about a 30-minute walk in a little park here in Bedford, and Lucky came home. His owner told me he took off 15 ticks off Lucky after that walk, and so they are here. Now this is a peripheral blood smear, and this is something that you would not see in New Hampshire 20 years ago. And if you look at this slide, these are red blood cells, and you can see that a few of them have these inclusion bodies in them. And this is a parasite called Babesia microti. And this is a parasite that you get from deer tick bite. Honestly, this was virtually non-existent in New Hampshire 30 years ago. And we're seeing scores of these in New Hampshire now. And this is just, if someone's getting a blood counter, a CBC, there's often a smear done on the blood, and the pathologist will look at this and see these inclusion bodies. And so when you do see this, you have to also be concerned that this patient may have other tick-related diseases. Now, Babesia microti, or babesiosis, it's called, is a self-limited disease. It usually just presents like a flu illness and will go away on its own. If you are immunocompromised in any way, you can get sick with this and may have to go to the hospital for antibiotics. But generally speaking, this is self-limited. But something that we're seeing more and more of as we're seeing more and more tick-borne diseases. And of course, the biggies are Lyme disease, anaplasmosis, and babesiosis. And you can see this graph shows how they have increased in the last 20 years. This Powassan virus infection is on the list, and we always make some smart aleck remark about how it's very dangerous, but thankfully we don't see it in New Hampshire. But actually, a member of our group sent an email out showing that there'd been a Powassan virus infection in New Hampshire recently. And this is a more dangerous one because it causes very bad encephalitis, but thankfully is still pretty infrequent. And this slide shows just Lyme disease case reports from 1996 to 2018. And each dot is a case. And you can see that it was really centered just around the mid-Atlantic states. And now 20 years later is really going up into New Hampshire and Maine, spreading right up the eastern seaboard. And people always ask, how come Massachusetts seems to have been excluded? They actually changed their reporting that year, and so it was not included in this graph. But the reason we're seeing this increase is just the longer frost-free season. So the period of time between the last frost in late March or early April, whenever it is, until the first frost, which now might even not be until the end of October, is increasing. And so that gives the deer ticks more time to be active. And so you can really now get ticks year round in New Hampshire, which is obviously a really big change. But again, just related to the warming climate. And this is just something I added. This does not have to do with warming climate, but I just want to point this out about plastics. And this, as people are aware, as the fossil fuel companies see there's going to hopefully be less money to be made selling gasoline in the future, they are switching in a really strong way to making more plastics. And this is an article that was in the New England Journal about 3 weeks ago and created quite a stir in the cardiovascular community. And it was a study done in Italy, and they took patients, 300 consecutive patients who were having a carotid endarterectomy. That's when you cut into the carotid artery and remove the plaque. And it's a fairly common surgery. So in these 300 patients, they looked at the plaque, examined the plaque, and found that in 60% of the carotid plaque, there were microplastics or nanoplastics seen in the plaque. And this is electron microscope view of the plastic particles inside this carotid plaque. So 60% of the patients had plastic in the carotid plaque, and then they followed the patients for 3 years. And they found that in patients who had plastic in their carotid plaque, they had over 3 times the cardiovascular risk for the next 3 years. So they had 3 times as many heart attacks, strokes, or sudden cardiac death events than patients who did not have plastics in their carotid. And it created quite a stir, with people even saying that microplastics might become a new cardiac risk factor alongside diabetes and hypertension. So just word to the wise. Okay, so this has been probably pretty depressing so far for everybody. I apologize for that. So let's talk about some reasons for hope. And I am hopeful that people care more about this issue than they have in the recent decades, and hopefully we can get somewhere with this. But there's basically respond to the climate crisis in a 2-pronged approach. We have mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation is just focused on reducing reductions or stabilizing the greenhouse gases. The bad thing here is that we know CO2 stays in the atmosphere for up to 1,000 years. So what's there is going to stay, and removing CO2 from the atmosphere is very expensive, very expensive production. And then there's also adaptation, where we say, well, even if we reduce CO2 emissions, we're still going to have continued warming, and we have to be able to adapt to this, by building seawalls and other things like that. So let's talk a little bit about mitigation, because we have many solutions available to us, and we just need to really use them in earnest. And we know that globally, wind could supply worldwide electricity consumption 40 times over. And we've made great progress in wind power. It's now over 8.4%, and huge increase in kilowatts from 2000 to 2020. And offshore wind is now up and running in a lot of places along the East Coast, and the Vineyard wind farm is actually up and running. They have a lot more turbines to put in, but they're already able to provide power for 60,000 homes in Massachusetts. So that is a work in progress. We also know that solar energy, enough solar energy reaches the Earth every hour to fill the world's energy needs for a full year, which is striking. And we know that use of solar power is increasing rapidly in the United States. And if you look at this, actually, this is the cost of electric generation in dollars per kilowatt hour. And if you look at solar and wind, were always the most expensive and had to be subsidized. But in fact, their technologies have improved so much that solar and wind are now the least expensive way to make electricity. And we know they're clean, healthy, it creates jobs, and it costs less. And let me give you just one example of what's going on in the state of Texas. Texas actually produces more wind and solar power than the next 3 states combined. And those next 3 states happen to be California, Iowa, and Oklahoma. And that about 30 to 35% of Texas's energy comes from wind. And earlier this year, they were getting about 30% actually from solar. So a huge amount from renewables. And because renewables are less expensive, a recent estimate showed that the cost of making electricity in Texas was lowered $11 billion last year, so that actually every customer saved $423. So just a great example of not only can it be done, but it can be done and it can save money for everybody. And I feel obliged to say something about nuclear energy. Nuclear energy always creates a lot of questions. It's very controversial and it's a very emotional topic for sure. But in fact, there are a couple of companies, a bunch of companies now actually, that are making new reactors. It's the so-called 4th generation reactors. They're small, modular, and much safer. They are cooled by liquid sodium or other liquid metals, so that they don't need the big cooling towers. And they can also use depleted uranium because they're more efficient. So you can actually take uranium that was used at a 1st or 2nd generation power plant and put it in these new reactors. And this TerraPower is actually very close to getting one online in Wyoming. And although they are controversial, I personally and a lot of the thought leaders think that we are going to need nuclear energy to get to zero. And I also just want to mention electric vehicles. I think there's a lot of misinformation about electric vehicles, because they do require a little more CO2, as you can see in this slide, to make. But when you look at the electric motors are so much more efficient that actually operation requires very little CO2. So this is just a comparison of a 10-year car life, electric versus gas, at how much CO2 emissions you're saving. And so that is a real improvement. I think we'll skip this in the interest of time. This is just a slide that shows US CO2 emissions. And the first thing to note is that they are going down. And this just shows what the so-called Inflation Reduction Act models to in terms of reducing carbon. we know this net zero pathway, the blue line, the blue dashed line is kind of the ideal. And the black and brown lines up here are kind of where we were. But the Senate Inflation Reduction Act, which really has been the biggest climate act ever in Washington, does show that this will, if everything goes as planned, this will bring CO2 emissions not to where they need to be, but we're certainly headed in the right direction. And this is also a little bit of good news, is that for the first time in 2022, the investment in green energy matched the investment in fossil fuel production. So we're getting there. And just one word about carbon fee and dividend. This is it's a little controversial, but I think it's really important. And this is felt by many economists something that we need to do in the United States to really start, slowing CO2 emissions. And so basically, with this program, you would charge companies for carbon pollution at the source. So when you pump oil out of the ground, you would be charged a certain fee per ton of CO2 that carbon is going to create. And the idea is that by paying that extra amount, it will, first of all, alter corporate behavior. And then the money is collected into a national carbon trust fund. And then citizens receive payments from the trust fund to offset the price increases. Because what would happen, obviously, is if the oil companies were charged this carbon fee, their prices would go up. And then citizens would receive on kind of an as-needed basis by income some of that money to help offset the other price increases. And this is preferred by most economists, actually worldwide. And there's a group here in New Hampshire, the New Hampshire Citizens Climate Lobby, which is really pushing for this. And they're a terrific group. So you might want to just look into that. This just looks at state renewables portfolio standards. And, a lot of states have set targets for when they want to have, either 100% or 50% renewable energy. And this is actually an old slide because both Massachusetts and Maine have committed to 100% renewable by 2050. Believe it or not, the state of Michigan, which is a big, car state and gas state, has committed to being carbon neutral by 2040. And this is New Hampshire's latest commitment. It's being 15% by renewables by 2040. And it's just a shame that we're so behind our New England neighbors. But there is a climate action plan being worked on actually right now, and our group has testified for this, and hopefully that is going to change. So finally, suggested actions. The most important thing that we can do is talk about it. The climate crisis has obviously been very politicized in the last decade. And so people are reluctant to talk about it. Studies show that in New Hampshire, that large majorities are concerned about the climate crisis, but only about 30% of people talk about climate because it's either off-putting or makes them uncomfortable. So that's what we think would be helpful. And other things that we can do is, call or write your elected officials, vote with the climate in mind. I think that's really important. We really need to have a little bit of change in mindset, certainly in Concord, to start taking the climate more seriously. Join a climate group. Talk about the climate. We have so many consumer choices now: heat pumps, induction stoves, electric vehicles, and certainly lifestyle choices, eating less red meat, walking when you can, as opposed to driving your car. Just lots of things that we can do. And so finally, I just want to leave you with this quote by Katharine Hayhoe, who is a climate scientist at Nature Conservancy, and also an evangelical Christian who says the climate is changing, humans are responsible, the impacts are serious, and the time to act is now. So we'll leave it there and be happy to have a discussion.
Well, great. Thank you
Ooh.
so much for that information. There are some really amazing statistics in there, and I know I learned a lot, so I appreciate all that work that you put into that. There are a few questions in the chat box, and I do know that Representative Sherry Dutsey would like to make a comment as well. I think you pointed
Okay.
out contacting your state rep. So Sherry.
Okay, great.
Oh,
Whoa.
just put it on the video. That's, yeah. Dr. Dewey, thank you so much. This is really, really important. I just wanted to quickly mention that everybody on this call, if they don't know who their state rep is and who their state senator is, they really can check it out. And I put the legislative website in the chat. So you can go up there and you can just go by where you live, and it's going to tell you who your representatives are. The reason is I sit on environment and agriculture, and last session, not this one, but the last session, we narrowly passed a bill, and it passed in the House. The American Chemical Association is putting pressure in all states to change legislation so that what they call advanced recycling, which is high heat incineration, be reclassified as a manufacturing process and not like a landfill process, like a recycling process. And the reason they want to do this is because they basically can circumvent all of the regulations that come along when you have to go through a permitting process. So manufacturing doesn't have the permitting process that you have in other things. It's really important for you to go up and look at how your representatives vote on climate issues. We lost that vote. I mean, we've been losing very important climate votes by 1 or 2 votes in the House.
Yeah.
So that's number one. They just voted down. We had students who wanted us to pass legislation to mandate or to encourage climate legislation in the schools. And that was voted down on a very narrow basis. Okay, so don't look at the party, look at the person. If they are running for re-election, please look. You can go up and look at all of their votes. The website makes it very easy. And secondly, I just want to put in a plug for newhampshirenetwork.org. Spell it out completely. They have a lot of subcommittees. I'm on the subcommittee for the plastics working group. We're looking at the microplastics, the nanoplastics, and all of that. So, don't look, to the rainforest or other areas of the world to get involved. New Hampshire needs a lot of help. And what Dr. Dewey showed, I see all the time. We have 5 New England states that are progressing in climate action, and New Hampshire is always at the bottom, or it's not even in the game. I mean, we've got to up it. Thank you. Thank you, Barbara, for letting me talk.
Oh, yes, Sherry, no, so important. And I agree. New Hampshire needs to really to get with the program here, and we need to do a better job of protecting our state and our climate and working with our other New England states. So let's see, we have one more minute. Maybe we can get one more question in here from Josh. It says, what steps can we take to minimize methane released from forested areas and tropical wetlands? As this appears to account for 40% of the methane released. That might not be something we can answer today, but maybe.
Yeah, honestly, I don't know the answer to that question. Right now, the permafrost is another area
Right.
that is releasing just tons of methane. I mean, and that you just have to stop the warming to take care of. And I think that we need to we know that agriculture is a big problem, and meat production. There's some of the Bill Gates in his book on how to fix the climate crisis talks a lot about these new synthetic meats. And, start putting money into those so we don't have to, raise as many animals and maybe slowly make that transition even. But, and
Well,
there's I think there's a lot of innovative things that some of these farmers are doing by trying to collect these gases, certainly. I don't know enough about it to say, but that certainly is also being done.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot that goes into climate change. So there's a lot out there, but we'll see if we can find some more information. And I just want to again thank Dr. Dewey for his time and that great presentation and all the good information that he
Thanks
gave
for
us
having me.
today. And I also want to let everybody know we are recording, and I will send this link out to everybody who registered, along with some links to the to New Hampshire General Court and New Hampshire Network and a few other resources that were recommended during this program. So you'll have more opportunity to dig in and find more information on what you can do to deal with climate change in your community. And just one more quick announcement. As Dr. Dewey mentioned, we have 2 more programs coming up. Environmental Justice and Health will be presented on Wednesday, May 8th, again at noon. And then we have Preserving Open Space, Promoting Spiritual and Mental Health, and that will be Wednesday, May 29th, again at noon. So, so thank you all for joining us. I really appreciate your time, and have a good afternoon. We'll stay in touch, and feel free to email me if you have any additional questions that you would like us to address that we weren't able to get to at the program today. Thanks again. Have a great afternoon.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.